Wyoming Territory, August 1887. The sun beat down with the particular ferocity of the high plains, baking the dust and drying the new lumber of a dozen homesteads rising from the valley floor. But Alara Vance was not framing walls or hewing logs. She was in the swamp. Day after day, while others raced to raise their winter shelters, she waded into the murky water at the edge of Miller's Creek, her skirts hitched high. She spent her hours gathering the long, brown seed heads of the common cattail. She harvested thousands. Back at her half-finished cabin, she laid them out to dry on vast canvases under the relentless sun. The town watched. They saw a woman neglecting the crucial work of building for the bizarre hobby of collecting swamp weeds. Her cabin, a small, unassuming structure, looked different from the others. It had two thin walls, spaced about 6 inches apart, a detail that baffled Silas Croft, the region's most respected builder. Then she began her true work. She broke open the dried, brittle seed heads, releasing clouds of soft, feathery fluff. This downy material, the plant's pappus, she began meticulously packing into the cavity between her cabin's inner and outer walls. It was tedious, dusty work. It looked insane. Children pointed, men at the trading post chuckled. They called it Alara's Folly, and later, more cruelly, the swamp house. They imagined the rot, the smell, the inevitable damp chill that would seep from her walls come the first frost. They predicted she and her family would be begging for shelter by November. What did this quiet woman, a recent arrival from a place no one had heard of, understand about insulation that every seasoned frontiersman and master carpenter had missed? She was building not just a shelter, but a shield. And as the Wyoming winter gathered its strength in the mountains, that shield was about to be tested by a force that would break everything else. If you want to see how ancient wisdom can outperform modern assumptions, subscribe to this channel right now, because the answer is not just clever, it is a lesson in survival. The problem in that valley, as in so many others across the frontier, was heat. Specifically, the catastrophic loss of it. A man could spend his summer felling and splitting a mountain of wood, only to watch it turn to ash in a desperate losing battle against the cold. The winter of 1886 had been a brutal teacher. It arrived early and stayed late, a relentless siege that found every crack and chink in a cabin's armor. The standard method of construction was a testament to strength and hard labor. Thick, interlocking logs, chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and horsehair. These were structures of immense solidity. They could stop a bullet, they could withstand a gale, but they could not hold heat. Solid wood, for all its mass, is a poor insulator. Heat energy, ever seeking equilibrium, simply travels through the dense material, bleeding out into the frigid air. The physics were inescapable. The settlers experienced this not as a formula in a book, but as a physical assault. They felt it as a constant draining draft that seemed to originate from the walls themselves. They saw it in the delicate tracery of frost that grew on the inside of their cabins, coating nail heads with ice and turning the walls into plains of biting cold. They heard it in the ceaseless, hungry roar of the fire in the hearth, a fire that had to be fed every hour, day and night. Families lived their lives in a small radius around the stove. Venture too far, and the cold would bite. Ink froze in its wells. Water left in a bucket overnight would be a solid block by morning, a man's beard would stiffen with his own crystallized breath just walking from the door to the woodpile. The human cost was immense. It was a winter of sickness, of pneumonia that stole the young and the old. It was a winter of gnawing hunger, as calories were burned simply to stay alive. It was a winter of exhaustion, a deep, soul-crushing weariness from the endless work of feeding the fire and the constant, oppressive chill. Alara Vance had watched all this during her first winter in the valley. She had lived it. Her husband, Thomas, had suffered a debilitating leg injury during their journey west, a break that had healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent limp and a vulnerability to the deep cold that made his bones ache with a fire of their own. Her daughter, little May, was just 5 years old, and Alara had spent the long nights listening to the child's shallow coughs, terrified the cold would take root in her small lungs. Alara was no engineer. She was not a carpenter. Her background offered a different kind of knowledge. She had grown up in the fens of eastern England, a vast, flat landscape of marshes, reeds, and waterways. It was a place of damp chill, where warmth was a precious commodity. She had not learned about insulation from books, but from observation. She had watched the marsh birds, the swans, and the moorhens build their nests. They used mud and sticks for structure, just like the settlers. But for the lining, for the part that cradled their precious eggs, they used the down of the cattail. She had seen those nests after a hard frost. The outside rimed with ice, while the inside remained a soft, warm, dry cup. She saw how the birds would return to a nest that had been rained on, and after shaking it out, it would be dry and fluffy again in the sun. The cattail fluff seemed to repel water while trapping air. Her father, a fenman who made his living harvesting reeds for thatch, had taught her the properties of the marsh plants. "Air is the warmest blanket, girl," he would say, "if you can only keep it from moving." He spoke of the thatch on their cottage, how a thick roof of reeds kept the house cool in summer and warm in winter, not because the reeds themselves were warm, but because of the thousands of tiny air pockets trapped within the dense layers. That was the principle she saw failing in Wyoming. The settlers built with solid mass. They were trying to build a fortress against the cold. Alara understood you could not fight the cold. You had to trick it. You had to build a trap for warmth. The conventional wisdom, embodied by men like Silas Croft, was that density equaled warmth. A thick wall was a warm wall. They saw Alara's thin double wall and scoffed. It looked flimsy, a waste of good lumber to create a hollow space that would surely just fill with cold air. They saw her gathering cattails and saw only a woman bringing the damp, rotting swamp into her home. They could not see the millions of tiny, hollow fibers in the fluff. They could not see the trap she was building for the air. They saw a swamp house. Alara saw a bird's nest, scaled for her family. The construction of the cabin was a spectacle. Thomas, despite his leg, could manage the heavy lifting of the frame, but the design was all Alara's. She insisted on 2 parallel frames, one for the exterior wall and one for the interior, separated by a 6-inch air gap. "You're building 2 cabins and getting the strength of neither," Silas Croft told her one afternoon, stopping by her homestead. He was not a malicious man. He was the valley's de facto building authority, a master carpenter from Ohio who had built more than half the structures in the settlement. His own home was a model of craftsmanship, with dovetail joints so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between the logs. He felt a sense of duty to prevent a foolish newcomer from building a death trap. "This gap," he said, tapping the hollow space between the studs with his knuckles. "What's your plan here? Just an empty space for mice and drafts?" "I mean to fill it," Alara said simply, not stopping her work of organizing the drying cattail heads. "Fill it with what? Sawdust? Manure? There's nothing you can put in there that won't settle or rot." She held up one of the fluffy seed heads. "With this." Silas stared at it. He looked from the brown plant matter to her face and back again. He was searching for a sign that she was joking. He found none. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that is swamp grass. You pack that in your walls, and you're building yourself a compost heap. The first bit of moisture that gets in there, and it will start to decay. The smell will be unbearable. Then comes the mold. It will eat your lumber from the inside out. Your house will be a damp, rotten, stinking wreck by springtime." His argument was perfectly logical. It was based on decades of experience with wood and weather. Moisture was the great enemy of any wooden structure. And what was a cattail if not a plant that grew directly in the water? To him, she was actively inviting the enemy inside her walls. "It will be dry," Alara replied, her voice calm and even. "I'm drying it first." "Drying it won't change its nature," Silas insisted, his tone hardening with frustration. "It's a sponge. It will draw the damp from the air. Every humid day, every thaw, it will soak it up. Mark my words, this is a terrible mistake." "I'm trying to keep my family warm," she said. It was not a defense. It was a statement of fact, the beginning and end of her reasoning. Silas shook his head and walked away. His verdict spread through the valley like a grass fire. It was not just a foolish idea. It was a dangerous one. The mockery took on a sharper edge. The cattail folly became the settled name. Women would stop by on the pretense of a social call, their eyes scanning the strange construction, whispering to each other as they left. Men would offer Thomas unsolicited advice, telling him to put a stop to his wife's nonsense before she killed them all. Alara ignored them. She and Thomas continued their work. Once the cattail heads were bone dry, they began the painstaking process of packing the wall cavity. She was careful not to compress the fluff too much. The goal was not to create a dense mass, but a light, airy fill. She understood that the fluff itself was not the insulator. The trapped air was. The science was simple, elegant, and centuries old. The cattail pappus consists of hollow, silky hairs designed by nature to catch the wind and carry seeds for miles. Each of these tiny hollow fibers is coated in a natural wax, which is what makes them water-resistant. When packed together, they create an incredibly complex, three-dimensional mesh. This mesh is a labyrinth for air. Air molecules, when heated, move faster and spread out, carrying thermal energy with them. This is convection, the engine of heat loss. In an open space, like a room, this creates currents that constantly transfer heat to colder surfaces, like walls. But inside Alara's wall, the air was not free to move. It was trapped in millions of microscopic pockets within the cattail matrix. A heated air molecule could not travel more than a fraction of a millimeter before colliding with a fiber and being stopped. Convection was almost entirely eliminated. Heat could still try to escape via conduction, passing from fiber to fiber. But here, too, the cattail was a brilliant material. The fibers were mostly hollow, filled with more air, and they touched each other at such small, infrequent points that the path for conduction was incredibly inefficient. Alara had, in effect, built a 6-inch wall of stationary air. It was a lung wrapped around her home that refused to exhale its warmth. By the time the first snows fell in October, the cabin was finished. From the outside, it looked plain, even a bit thin-walled compared to the mighty log structures nearby. The only clue to its secret was the lack of chinking. The clapboard siding, both inside and out, was nailed tight. The folly was ready. Then December came. It began not as a storm, but as a stillness. The air grew unnaturally calm, the sky a hard, pale blue. The temperature, which had been hovering in the teens, began to drop with an alarming speed. The temperature at dawn on December 21st was 14 degrees Fahrenheit. A cold day, but not unusual. By sunset, the thermometer on the trading post porch read -4. The old-timers looked at the sky and saw no clouds, but they felt a deep, ancestral dread. This was no ordinary cold front. This was something else. They called it the Great White Silence. The wind did not howl. It had a low, menacing moan that never ceased. The snow began to fall, not in flakes, but as a fine, dry powder, like sand. It was driven by the wind into every crack and crevice, piling in drifts that reshaped the landscape by the hour. By the second day, the temperature was -20, and that was before the wind. The settlement hunkered down. The battle for heat began in every home. The fires that had been kept at a steady glow were now stoked to a roaring inferno. The consumption of firewood became terrifying. A cord of wood that should have lasted 2 weeks was gone in 3 days. Inside the conventional log cabins, the cold was winning. The massive logs, once cooled to the ambient temperature, became colossal blocks of ice. They radiated cold. The walls were no longer shelters. They were the enemy. Families abandoned all but one room, hanging blankets over doorways to concentrate what little heat they had. They huddled together, wrapped in every blanket and pelt they owned. The frost crept inward. It sealed windows shut with a thick, opaque layer of ice. It coated the iron latches and hinges. It climbed the walls. In the Croft cabin, a pitcher of water left on a table 10 feet from the fire froze solid. Silas Croft, the master builder, found his expertise was meaningless. His perfect joints, his thick walls, they were failing. He burned through his woodpile at a rate that filled him with a cold, mathematical fear. He could calculate, almost to the hour, when his fuel would run out. He and his wife took turns sleeping, one always awake to feed the voracious fire. The cold was a physical weight, pressing in on them, stealing their energy, their hope. On the third day, the crisis deepened. Livestock began to die in the barns, frozen where they stood. The fine, wind-driven snow was now so deep that it buried cabins up to their roof lines, plunging the inhabitants into a dim, perpetual twilight. The community was cut off, each family an isolated island in a sea of white. And in his own freezing home, fighting a losing battle, Silas Croft's thoughts turned to Alara Vance. He thought of her thin-walled cabin, her insane notion of stuffing it with swamp weeds. A grim certainty settled on him. No one could survive this in a house like that. The flimsy walls would offer no protection. The cattails, if they hadn't already turned to a frozen, moldy sludge, would be useless. He pictured the family inside, the husband with his bad leg, the little girl. A terrible vision bloomed in his mind. A silent, frozen cabin, a family that had succumbed to the cold, victims of stubborn foolishness, and he, the expert, had done nothing but mock them. He had not forced them to reconsider. He had just walked away, confident in his own superior knowledge. A feeling colder than the wind outside washed over him. It was guilt. What if he was right, and they were dying because no one had intervened? He had to know. He had to try to help. Before the vindication, before the numbers and the proof, you need to understand the stakes of that moment. A man was about to risk his life in a blizzard, motivated by the fear that his own arrogance had condemned a family. It's a powerful turning point, and if you want to make sure you don't miss stories with this kind of depth, take a second to hit that like button. It tells us you value these moments of human drama as much as the engineering itself. The journey to the Vance cabin was a battle for every step. The distance was less than half a mile, a casual stroll in summer. In the blizzard, it was a polar expedition. The wind tore at Silas, stealing his breath and blinding him with a torrent of ice particles. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, granular powder that offered no purchase. He navigated by memory, aiming for the stand of aspens that grew behind Alara's homestead. He could not see more than 10 feet in any direction. The world was a churning vortex of white and gray. Several times he fell, plunging into the suffocating powder, fighting his way back to his feet with a burning in his lungs. The cold was a physical pain, a sharp, crystalline agony in his bones. He was driven by the grim image in his head. He had to know if they were alive. He expected, at best, to find them huddled and freezing, their fire long dead. At worst, he expected silence. When he finally stumbled past the aspens and saw the faint, dark outline of the cabin, he felt a surge of dread. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. His worst fears were confirmed. He had been so certain of his own expertise, and his certainty had become their tombstone. The fire was out. They were gone. He staggered to the door, his beard a solid mass of ice, his limbs numb and clumsy. He raised a gloved fist and hammered on the wooden planks. The sound was flat, swallowed by the wind. He pounded again, shouting their name, his voice a raw croak. He was preparing to shoulder the door, to force his way into the frozen tomb, when he heard a sound from within. A bolt being drawn back. The door swung inward, and Silas Croft was hit by a wave. It was not a sound, not a sight. It was a physical force that struck him in the face and rolled over his body. It was a wave of warmth. It was thick with the smell of baking bread and drying wool, and something else. Simple, clean, living air. Alara Vance stood in the doorway. She was not wearing a coat. She was not wrapped in a blanket. She wore a simple wool dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a dusting of flour on her forearms. Behind her, in the soft lamplight, Silas saw a scene of impossible domestic peace. Her husband, Thomas, sat at a small table, calmly mending a leather harness, his own sleeves rolled high, and on the floor, playing with a set of wooden blocks, was their daughter, May. She was barefoot. Silas stared, uncomprehending. His mind, numbed by the cold and prepared for tragedy, could not process the information. Barefoot. The word echoed in his thoughts. Children were not barefoot in this weather. They were bundled in so many layers they could barely move. Silas? Alara's voice was calm, tinged with concern. You should not be out in this. Come in, quickly. He stumbled inside, and she shut the door, sealing off the roaring chaos of the storm. The silence within the cabin was as shocking as the warmth. The wind was a distant whisper, not a physical assault. He looked around the single room. There was no frost on the walls. The single-pane windows were clear, save for a bit of condensation at the bottom edges. Steam rose from a kettle on the small cast-iron stove. The fire within it was not a raging inferno. It was a bed of gently glowing embers, fed by a single, modest-sized log. He was an expert builder. His mind, recovering from the shock, began to work, to analyze. He walked to the north wall, the one that took the full force of the wind. He had expected it to be radiating a killing cold. He pressed his bare hand against the interior clapboard. It was warm, not just neutral. It was perceptibly, undeniably warm to the touch. He turned back to Alara, his face a mask of disbelief. How? He managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Your fire. It's so small. It is all we need, she said. But your woodpile, he stammered, his eyes darting to the corner where the firewood was stacked. We are burning through a cord every 3 days. You must be nearly out. Thomas spoke from the table, his voice calm. We have used less than a quarter of our first cord. The numbers landed on Silas like a physical blow. A quarter of a cord. In 3 days of the worst cold in living memory. He was burning 10 times that amount, and his own house was an icebox. It defied every law of building he had ever known. He had to see the data for himself. On a small shelf near the stove, he saw it. A spirit thermometer. He walked over and picked it up. His hand trembled slightly as he held it to the light. The red line was clear and steady. It read 66 degrees. 66 degrees. Outside, the temperature was plunging past -30. That was a temperature differential of nearly 100 degrees, maintained by a small, gentle fire, with walls that he had personally declared to be a death trap. The walls, he said, his voice now full of a strange awe. The cattails. Alara nodded. She led him to a small, inconspicuous panel in the corner of the room, held in place by wooden turn buttons. She opened it, revealing the 6-inch cavity. Silas leaned in. He saw the soft gray-brown mass of fluff, packed loosely. He reached in and touched it. It was utterly dry and warm, like the downy feathers of a nesting bird. There was no smell of rot, no hint of damp. There was only the faint, earthy scent of the dried plant. He pulled his hand back and stared at it, as if he had touched something magical. All his experience, all his hard-won knowledge, all his certainty had crumbled to dust in that moment. He had been basing his logic on the properties of a solid log. He had failed to see that Alara was not building with a solid at all. She had built her house out of air. He stood up and looked at her, at this quiet woman who had endured the scorn of the entire community. He saw no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." He saw only a calm, steady competence. He took a deep breath, the warm, clean air filling his aching lungs. The words felt heavy in his mouth, but he knew they had to be said. "I was wrong," he said. The admission was stark, absolute. "Everything I said about your house, I was completely wrong. This works. This is a miracle." He paused, then looked at her with the eyes of a student addressing a master. "You have to teach me how you did this. You have to teach us all." When the great blizzard finally broke after 5 days, the valley emerged into a changed world. The silence was replaced by the sounds of digging, of men checking on their neighbors, of counting the costs. The stories of suffering were everywhere. 2 families had been forced to burn their furniture to survive. An elderly trapper, living alone, was found frozen in his cabin. The loss of livestock was devastating. But then, a different story began to circulate. It started with Silas Croft. He did not just recount his experience. He became a zealous evangelist. He gathered the men at the trading post, his voice ringing with the passion of a convert. He described the warmth. He described the barefoot child. He described the single log burning gently in the stove. They were skeptical at first. They thought the cold had gotten to him. But Silas was their expert, the man whose judgment they had always trusted. His conviction was unshakable. He took a small group of the settlement's leaders to the Vance cabin. They entered, one by one, from the biting cold into the impossible warmth. They pressed their own hands against the north wall. They saw the small woodpile. They saw the thermometer. They looked at Alara Vance with a new, profound respect. The mockery was gone, replaced by a stunned silence, and then a flood of questions. The name Cattail Folly died that day. In its place, a new term was born, the Wyoming Wall, or sometimes simply the Vance Wall. Replication began almost immediately. Led by Silas, work crews were organized. It was too late in the winter to build new cabins, but they could be retrofitted. Silas, applying his carpenter's mind to Alara's principle, devised a way to add an interior stud wall to the existing log cabins, creating the necessary cavity. The valley's swamps were harvested. The cattails, once seen as useless weeds, were now a precious resource. The late winter sun was filled with the sight of men and women gathering and drying the seed heads, preparing the fluff that had become their salvation. Alara became the community's most sought-after teacher. She never sought the role, but she accepted it with quiet grace. She held workshops demonstrating the proper technique for packing the fluff, not too tight, never compressed. She explained the importance of keeping it dry, of ensuring the outer wall was well sealed against rain. She shared her knowledge freely, without any expectation of payment or fame. Her reward was seeing the change. The following winter, the valley was transformed. Cabin after cabin now sported the Vance Wall. The change was not just structural, it was social. The endless, exhausting war against the cold was over. Fires were smaller, easier to maintain. The staggering consumption of firewood was cut by more than 70% across the settlement. The real impact was measured not in cords of wood, but in human lives. Children were healthier. The elderly survived the winters in greater numbers. Families were no longer confined to the hearth. They could use their entire homes. The oppressive, soul-crushing dread of winter receded. It was still a harsh season, but it was no longer a siege. It was something that could be endured in comfort, even in dignity. The idea spread. Trappers and traders who passed through the valley saw the innovation and took the knowledge with them to other settlements. The Wyoming Wall, in various forms and with local adaptations, began to appear across the high plains, a quiet revolution started by a woman who had paid attention to the wisdom of a nesting bird. The story of Alara Vance and her cattail cabin is a powerful reminder that innovation does not always come from the halls of science or the workshops of acclaimed experts. Sometimes it comes from quiet observation, from a willingness to trust knowledge that lies outside the accepted tradition. It demonstrates the profound arrogance of dismissing an idea simply because it is unfamiliar. The core principle of her design, trapping air in small pockets to stop heat transfer, is the very foundation of modern insulation technology. The pink fiberglass in our attics and the rigid foam boards in our walls are nothing more than sophisticated man-made versions of Alara's cattail fluff. They are simply more efficient matrices for trapping air. She had rediscovered a fundamental law of thermal dynamics, using nothing more than a local plant and an observant eye. This story is about more than just staying warm. It's a testament to the power of empirical evidence over popular opinion. For months, Alara was the subject of scorn. But when the great test came, the opinions of the entire town mattered less than the single, inarguable number on her thermometer. If this story changed how you think about where true wisdom comes from, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten histories of incredible frontier ingenuity. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account inspired by historical building practices and the principles of natural insulation. While pioneers did use various materials like moss, sawdust, and animal hair for chinking and insulation, the characters, specific events, and the narrative of Alara Vance and Silas Croft are creations used for educational and storytelling purposes. This content is intended to illustrate scientific principles in a historical context and does not constitute professional building or engineering advice.